Dr. Wezangula has given us, I think, an enormously rich and insightful picture of what it really takes to tackle AMR at a country level. Immediate takeaways from me include the importance of political leadership, the economic arguments, communication, practical planning, practical problem solving, and I love the last word around persistence. Our next speaker, if Dr. Westangula was taking the country angle, our next speaker is taking much more of a specific disease angle, in this case, TB. Robert Newman is Vice President and Global Head of TB Programs at J&J and brings extensive experience, having worked in CDC, WHO, Gavi. Robert.
Great. Thanks very much. It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. Up until about 6 weeks ago, I would have been giving a country perspective of Cambodia, where I have been living for the last 2 years, and it was very interesting to see the parallels, even though half a world away, between what we're facing in Cambodia and the challenges that Kenya has been facing as well. But I'm not here to talk about Cambodia. I'm actually here to talk about tuberculosis and a bit about the story of Bedaquiline and how the partnerships around the development and deployment of Bedaquiline, I think, chart a way forward for us in tuberculosis. So first, a very brief introduction about where I sit within Johnson & Johnson, a very large company of 127,000 people. I am part of a relatively new initiative that started in 2014 called Global Public Health. And if the core business, the commercial business, is off to the left, and corporate social responsibility and philanthropic endeavors are off to the right, GPH is a new model that's supposed to be a self-sustaining entity within the organization on cross-sector product and solution-centric innovations to improve patient outcomes, but in a way that we can sustain that. It's actually not, it's not philanthropy, it's part of our business model. The hope is that these three different streams, and we do of course have corporate social responsibility as well, that these three streams help us create the sort of healthcare company that we imagine is the healthcare company we would like to see for the future. So this GPH endeavor currently has four main pillars to it: tuberculosis, HIV, mental illness, and soil-transmitted helminths. And then there are a number of cross-cutting platforms that are also being worked on, including vaccines, global health security, and global surgery. So most of you in this room know this story. We went a very, very long time without new tuberculosis medicines. I mean, 40 years, right? And so that has created an enormous challenge, and we had a very empty pipeline in tuberculosis, a story that sounded familiar to me in terms of what malaria was like maybe 15 or 20 years ago. And we were facing an enormous burden of multi-drug resistant TB, nearly 600,000 incidence cases a year, very few of those treated, a very dismal cure rate, especially if you look at what's happening in extremely drug-resistant tuberculosis. So a very grim picture. And into this comes a new drug developed by Johnson & Johnson called Janssen Pharmaceuticals. It's the pharmaceutical company of Johnson & Johnson, and that's Bedaquiline. A new class of TB drugs, ATP synthase inhibitor, and a very powerful medicine. And in 2016, this is the most recent interim guidelines from WHO, is that it's actually reserved for adult multi-drug resistant patients who are not eligible for the WHO short regimen, including patients with resistance or intolerance to fluoroquinolones or injectables, and patients with extremely drug resistant or XDR TB, which means it's about 30% of the patient pool of MDR who are eligible for Bedaquiline. So that would be about 37,000 patients worldwide. But we're a long way from reaching that number. Really see the whole story of TB as a case for collaboration. So if you look at some of the challenges we're facing, whether it's constrained funding, weak healthcare delivery systems, limited diagnostic capacity, poor prescribing and adherence practices, patient populations with limited resources, and inadequate standards of care, all of it tied together by somehow this sort of complacency and acceptance in TB. I mean, it's always the third fiddle, even if you look at the Global Fund, you know, it's the third category of funding. And it's into that environment that Bedaquiline has moved, enabling potentially the better treatment of MDR TB and becoming a standard of care. And I think galvanizing hope for a lot of people that XDR-TB particularly is not a hopeless endeavor. So again, it takes a lot, and we're in a session about collaboration, and this is by no means an exclusive, these are some of the partners involved, and if anybody with whom we're partnering is left out, apologies, but these represent some of the major partnerships involved in sort of developing and getting bedaquiline out there, whether it's on-the-ground partners like PATH, the Union in terms of new trials, USAID and the donation program, the Global Drug Facility and getting the drug out there, Farm Standard in Russia and CIS, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as intellectual partners and funders, the TB Alliance in drug development, and the Stop TB Partnership and overall advocacy, enormously, enormously important partners. So this is the status of registration today as of May. And right now, if you look at the top list or the top category of countries, we actually have registration in countries that cover 70% of the high burden countries for MDR. And we've submitted for registration in countries that cover another 8%. I think one of the things, and we'll talk a bit more about this, is how with new regimens coming down, with new molecules in development, how do we speed up that process? How do we make sure there's not such a lag between innovation and uptake if we're going to keep people incentivized to fund new innovations? So I'm going to just briefly, these are not slides I expect you to read all the details. More it's to look at the logo soup in the middle, right? It takes an enormous amount of partnership to help governments change TB programs that haven't seen a new drug in a tremendously long time, and to actually build a system of stewardship around bedaquiline so that we're sure that it reaches the patients who need it, but we don't foster the development of resistance for a drug that we desperately need. South Africa's in the lead. South Africa has been a tremendous leader in actually getting bedaquiline out there, and you can see how many partners are involved in South Africa. A couple things to highlight. One really interesting thing that's emerged in South Africa is that ototoxicity is a huge problem on existing regimens. We knew that, but I don't think we appreciated the scale of it until routine audiometry was introduced. So it's the sort of thing that we wouldn't have thought about that suddenly becomes a critical thing in rolling out a new medicine. And I just focus on the quote on the lower right corner of this, which is the treatment outcomes in pre-XDR and XDR-TB. The patients are now receiving bedaquiline are overtaking outcomes in MDR-TB in patients who aren't receiving bedaquiline, just to give some idea of the power of the drug in terms of saving lives. In India, again, not expecting to read the fine print here, it's just how many different partners are involved in trying to get India. India has 6 sites currently where bedaquiline is being administered, and they are scaling up to 156 sites during this year. That's an enormous effort, and it takes an enormous number of partners on the ground to make that happen in a country with such enormous burden, complex health system, and an enormous number of people. So we have a lot of hopes for India. India has a lot of hopes for itself. As many of you may be aware, the Indian Minister of Health has declared India's goal to eliminate malaria by, malaria. Who can tell that I used to be in malaria? Yes. Yeah, please don't tell anybody I just did that. Yeah, it's 20 years in malaria, 6 weeks in TB. It's going to take a little while. So anyway, it's a huge opportunity for India, but a huge challenge. They've set very ambitious goals for themselves. And in China, just getting going, China, of course, in another country with enormous burden, and their access program, and just getting underway now, again, an enormous number of partners to get a program going with bedaquiline to treat XDR patients in China on the way to a commercial launch in China in 2019. So the donation program and our partnership with USAID has been crucial for getting bedaquiline out there. As many of you may know, we have this 4-year program underway right now with a commitment to fund up to 30,000 treatments, over 100 low and middle income countries eligible, following global fund eligibility criteria, and making sure that countries have agreed to appropriate use in following WHO guidance, and hoping to generate through this insights into real-world use of bedaquiline. Again, just to see that many partners, even in this partnership, many partners on the ground, whether it's us, Janssen/J&J, Global Drug Facility, USAID, IDA, and then USAID has many partners on the ground, including FHI 360, helping in the rollout of the donation program. It's a very complicated endeavor, and really, I think, has been at the heart of saving a lot of lives over the last couple of years. So where are we today? I think this gets after something. This drug actually received FDA approval in 2013. We're now in 2017. We saw the enormous need out there of MDR and XDR patients, and we are now, I think my team told me yesterday, this now may be over 13,000 patients. So that's great. There's 13,000 patients who've gotten this drug, but we're a long way from having the sort of path to access of speeding up, taking innovation and getting it out there in the way that I think we need to. And I think if we're going to incentivize investors to fund in innovation, we have to demonstrate that we're ready to capitalize on that innovation as it emerges and roll those innovations out and get them to affected people as quickly as possible. I'm going to turn just for the last few minutes of this talk to thinking about how this ties into AMR more broadly and what the future may look like in terms of product development. So again, I've mentioned on the left here the Bedaquiline, first novel mechanism of action in 40+ years for tuberculosis. We have new tools under development, and I'll touch on that more in terms of shorter regimens, new platforms, and novel targets. Obviously, part of this is getting infrastructure in place, so having global guidelines for antibiotic stewardship, partnerships with the Global Drug Facility for controlled distribution, investments in surveillance, and we had some very good talks about the importance of surveillance yesterday, and detection, a very good talk this morning on diagnostics, health system capacity, and education. And that health system capacity is an enormous issue in terms of rolling out new interventions for tuberculosis. There is transformational potential, I think, right now in terms of XDR and MDR TB, but we need to help build robust health systems to capitalize on it. And again, it's part of addressing the larger issues around AMR with the enormous global impact that AMR can have in terms of impact on GDP through some of the modeling. So this is 2 slides, and I was really enjoyed the talk earlier on the need for different mechanisms of how are we going to really incentivize development of new regimens, new drugs, new diagnostics. I thought the very good question of how do we take some of that idea around incentivizing therapeutics and apply that to diagnostics, tremendously important, because the current situation is just not ideal, right? There just isn't a market out there for these sort of medicines that justifies the investment that's required to develop them. And so we don't really we have market failure, and we don't have an adequate system of pull incentives to pull through the treatments that we all want to see. And so in terms of fostering a healthy AMR ecosystem, we need to build on existing structures and concepts. We need a networked solution that involves all sorts of players, including academia, governments, and industry. Make sure that there's risk-sharing mechanisms for developing new molecules and some sort of market entry award or incentives. And again, I thought the talk earlier this morning was really excellent. We need equitable procurement mechanisms to ensure the sustainability of funding and manufacturing, and we need a structure for stewardship and post-approval support. Of course, it's no good to develop fantastic new medicines if they get out there in uncontrolled use and then we lose them quickly. Malaria, and now I'm intentionally saying the word malaria. Malaria, we obviously have a lot of experience with that, right? Artesunate got out there as monotherapy into Southeast Asia, not protected by another molecule in a fixed dose combination, and we lost it, right? And so while it's still effective in Africa, we have widespread artemisinin resistance today because we did not have appropriate stewardship in place, and we don't want to see that happen again. We need to use the learnings from the rollout of Bedaquiline development and access to inform the creation of new tools. In terms of clinical evaluation, we need to leverage the Bedaquiline registry and other infrastructure for faster evaluation. We need to build faster approval pathways in key markets and finding a way to share costs of post-approval commitments, which can be onerous. We need to figure out forecasting for low-volume manufacturing. This is challenging, and we need to use the rollout of Bedaquiline to help improve our predictions. And we need to take advantage of existing market access strategies and programs for faster rollout. And this slide, this is vastly simplified, and not everyone necessarily progresses like this. We know that MDR patients can transmit to MDR patients directly, but for the sake of argument, this just looked at where we might intervene in the future. Today, Bedacoline's out there as part of a 24-month course, and it's saving a lot of lives, but it's still a pretty serious regimen. So what does the future look like? The near future could be all oral short course, maybe 6-month, ideally fixed dose combination for multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, and also an effective short fixed dose combination with low toxicity for all comers with active TB. And we're really thinking about, and there's a lot of thinking going on right now about this, about a pan-TB regimen, something that could be used to treat everybody with tuberculosis. No longer a need to distinguish between those who have drug-sensitive and drug-resistant tuberculosis, although we probably should always have in our back pocket a highly effective salvage therapy if that regimen should fail. And ultimately, we're doing a lot of thinking about latent TB. What would it look like to have a long-acting delivery platform to tackle the huge issue of latent TB? Now, I use the term latent because that's what's used. It's actually not the right term. I think it's bred complacency. It's not latent, right? Maybe it's silent, but it's not latent. There is actually a constant battle going on between MTB and its human host in terms of dominance. And we all know that, of course, we don't predict very well the 10% of people who eventually progress. Ultimately, a vaccine, of course, would be fantastic, and having a vaccine to prevent infection in the first place would be wonderful. I end on 2 slides. So latent, we have 2 billion people in the world infected with tuberculosis. That's an amazing number, right? I think many people don't realize how big that number is. You in this room, I'm sure, do. Cambodia, you may not be able to see that little dot over there, over in Southeast Asia. More than 50% of people in Cambodia have latent tuberculosis. It's a pretty stunning number. So what is our strategy? I think we do have to deal with this. We talk a lot about what can we do today for multi-drug resistant, but ultimately we need to turn off the tap. If we're really going to win, we have to envision a world where we're not constantly battling with tuberculosis, but we actually see its end. And this slide, and it's my last slide, is from the End TB strategy. And you see there's 2 inflection points in this. The first is optimizing the use of the tools we have today, and that's the inflection point we need to be at right now. We need to take the tools we have and maximize their use. And second, we need to introduce new tools, and that's that second inflection point. And that requires a lot of investment, a lot of thought about what is the incentive mechanism for the development of those tools. And while I focused on therapeutics today, I loved the diagnostics talk today, and I had a busier version of that development slide that also had diagnostics in it, because that, for tuberculosis, is going to be every bit as critical as the new therapeutics. Thank you very much.